Hi everyone. Have you ever encountered this problem before that you did some changes in your DBT model, then you ran it, and then you accidentally broke a table which was being used by some of your team in the company, let's say a finance team, and they were actively using this particular table in a live dashboard, which means that dashboard is either showing incorrect numbers or is not loading at all because that table is broken. If you have encountered this problem before, then this is because you might not know that there is a concept called as environments that exist in DBT and you are not utilizing that. If you know about DBT environments very briefly and you want to understand end to end as to why do you need a DBT environment, what actually is a DBT environments, how many should you set this up, how do you actually set this up in the DBT core, like in the VS Code, how do you do that, then this particular video will help you answer all of these questions. If you're new here, then I am Radhika and this is my YouTube channel DataZard. I am doing this DBT series end to end where I am building a HR analytics project or end to end, and I'm using DBT concepts and I'm applying them so that I can show you not just by theory as to what these concepts are, but to show you their practical implementation as well. And in this particular video, I'm going to be talking about the DBT environments. So now without further ado, let's get started. Let us first start with understanding what actually is a DBT environment. Now to explain this, I'm first going to use an analogy. Using that, I'm going to explain why would you need an DBT environment, and then we will dive into the DBT concepts. The analogy that I'm using this time would be about learning to drive. So when you first start, you don't get the keys handed to you and you're not told to merge into the highway traffic during rush hour straight away. You're first going to practice somewhere like in a parking lot where you might just stall the car somewhere, you might clip a cone, or you would just stop suddenly. So in this whole process, when you're doing these things, these are all the errors. You cannot stop anywhere, you just cannot clip a cone, or you cannot just stop suddenly somewhere in the middle of the road. But when you're doing this in a parking lot, and in this process, nobody is going to get hurt, nothing is going to get damaged, and the parking lot is like your safe space to experiment and to learn. And once you become confident, then you're just going to drive on the actual road where you will have real traffic, you will have real passengers and real consequences if you're going to make any mistake. And this is the same thing that we can relate to in the DBT world as well. So if we apply the same idea in DBT, then generally we can say that we have a development environment, which is also called as dev sometimes. So this is like your parking lot. So in here you can run models, you can rerun the models, then you can test things, you can break things, you can do anything over here, and the only person that is affected is you. You are the only one who's gonna have these broken things hanging around. The other environment is usually a production environment. Let us make things simple for now. So production, it is also called as prod. You must have engineers use these terms, dev environment, prod environment. Now this is exactly your real route. The example that we were using before. This is what is going to feed into your dashboards, which CEO could be using, which your finance team could be using. So reports that somebody is generating. So all of this is going to come from the production dashboard. And if you make any mistake over here, then there are going to be consequences because these dashboards, these reports, which CEO is using or finance team is using or some other team is using, they're going to be broken. So these are development environments and production environment. Dev is what is your parking lot. Production is what is your real road. This was at a very high level. Now usually there are two types of environments. So this is your development environment and this one is your deployment environment. Now this development environment is your dev. This is where you're going to work iteratively, you're going to write new code, you're going to test new models, you're going to break some things, etc. You can do anything over here because this is not touching your dashboards or reports. It's just your own local environment. There can only be one development environment, but there can be n number of deployment environments. So what happens is, in between development and production, there is something called as staging environment as well. So staging environment is also kind of a deployment environment. So usually what happens is, when you're working, then you will make things in your development environment. When you are happy with those changes, then you're going to push them into your staging environment. So this is your deployment environment. You have deployed your dev stuff into staging stuff. And then from staging environment, you will push it to production. So these two, they are your deployment environments, and there is only one development environment. Because if it's just you who's working, why would you have multiple development environments? So there's just gonna be one dev environment, and there could be multiple deployment environments. Always remember, there is a difference. You can push to different environments. That's why deployment environments are many, but you can only develop in one. That's just your own environment. That's why development environment is just one. Development environment is usually referred to as dev, but the deployment environment, it could be staging, it could be prod, it could be also called as pre-prod. This is sometimes called as pre-prod. So these are the terms which you will hear depending on how the company has set up these environments. So these are what environments are in DBT. Now let us try to understand in terms of DBT as to why we can't just use one environment. Earlier, I used an analogy of learning to drive to explain you why we are first taught on empty spaces and then we move to highways and busy roads and everything for our driving. In a similar way, when it comes to DBT projects, let us go to our HR analytics project, and in here, now imagine that for this particular project, this attrition goal scoring model, leadership team uses this particular model in a dashboard, and that dashboard they view every Monday morning. Now, if you only have this one environment, which is essentially your production environment, then every time when you're going to add new models, add new columns to these existing models, or make any changes, it actually means that you are overwriting these live tables which everyone is being dependent on. Leadership team has a dashboard which is dependent on this particular goal attrition model, and you are making live changes over here. So if this one breaks, then that dashboard will also break, and leadership team might not be able to view the results, or they might be seeing incorrect things happening. So if you test a new column, that dashboard could break. If you tweak a join, it could be possible that that join is not applied properly and that dashboard breaks. If the numbers they are shifting silently, then nobody will notice until somebody is going to come and ask you that, hey, last week when I was checking this attrition score for this particular employee, it was some other number, but this time it is very different. Can you explain what is happening and which number is correct? So all of these situations could happen if you are just having one environment, which is essentially your production environment, where you are overwriting stuff again and again every day when you are building your DBT models. So this is why it is important that we have a separate dev environment and we have a prod environment. So at least two environments. In your dev environment, you could just run, you can test things, you can intentionally break stuff to understand what you can do to improve the models, or you can do anything there. And because it is just you who's using that particular environment, so nobody else is affected and you can do anything over there. When it comes to production environment, you only pass those things from your test environment to your production environment when it is safe to do so, when they are approved, and when you know that you have tested them thoroughly and nothing is breaking, and then that's when you push it to production. If anything breaks in dev, nothing happens. If anything breaks in prod, leadership team or the people who are dependent on those particular models, because they are using models in particular dashboards, they will all get affected. So that is why in a real project, it is non-negotiable to have at least two environments. One dev, another is prod. You could have three environments, like dev environment, then a staging environment or a pre-prod environment, and a prod environment. So we'll see all of these things later on in the project, but I hope you are able to understand that why we just cannot have one environment. Till now, we have understood what is an environment, what are the different types of environments, and how many do we actually need for a DBT project. Let us now unpack how do we mechanically create an environment in DBT core. And in this particular video, I'm going to be explaining this theoretically because theory is important. And then in the coming video next Thursday, I will be doing the practical implementation. If I do them both in this particular video, it's going to be too long to follow. That is why I'm splitting them into two. So essentially, what is an environment in DBT? In DBT core, there is actually nothing like environment. You will not see anything called as environment. We have seen things like models, macros, tests, snapshots, etc. But nowhere you will see an object called as environment in DBT. You can go over here and check yourself. There isn't anything like that. So then how do we create an environment in DBT? So what you actually do is, if you remember the profiles.yaml file that we created initially in the first few videos where we were setting up DBT, in that particular file, there is something called as target, and that target is what we need to actually configure, which actually relates to an environment in DBT. So that target variable is going to bundle together every DBT needs to connect and to build. So I'm going to show you a sample profiles.yaml file. This is not my actual file because if I expose these credentials and anybody can just connect it. So these are just dummy things that I have written over here. So this will be your project name. Whatever is your project name, that should come over here. Then you see this target variable. This is what I'm talking about when I'm saying that this is how we configure environments in DBT. Now let us go to these fields one by one to understand these properly. Let us first check out these outputs. These outputs, they contain two things. First is dev, then we have prod. So this dev and prod, these are your environments. You can replace this target with dev or prod depending on what you want to use. So currently this target is pointing to dev, which means that we are telling DBT that hey, we want to connect to DBT's dev environment and then do whatever we are doing in that dev environment. We can change this to prod to indicate to DBT that whatever now we are doing, we want to put it in the prod environment. So in this dev and prod, the first thing that you see is type. Type is the type of adapter that you are using. Now, if you're connecting to Snowflake, this will be Snowflake. If you're connecting to Redshift, this would be Redshift. If you're connecting to BigQuery, it will be BigQuery. So whatever adapter that you are using, that will be written in your type. Now, the second thing is database. So as you can see over here, we have these two environments, dev and prod, and we have defined two different databases over here. In dev, we have said that we want to connect to HR Analytics dev database, and in prod environment, we are saying we want to connect to HR Analytics prod database. It is up to you how you want to configure it. You can have the same database for both of them, but have different schemas, or you could have separate databases. It is totally up to you. I would say as best practice, you have two different databases so that you never merge one into another or never put accidentally dev stuff into prod or prod stuff into dev. So this is how DBT ensures that your databases, they are different so that no query touches an incorrect database. Next, we have got schema. So for our dev schema, we can define a different schema and a different schema for our prod. This is just the default schema. We have already seen that using config either in the dbt_project.yaml file, we can define schema over here, or we can just directly go to one of these models and update the config in the model itself. So we can say over here schema. So whatever schema we have over here will get overridden by those configs. So there is a config precedence that happens, but this is how you are telling DBT that if you cannot find anything related to config, then come over here and use these particular schemas in these particular databases to send the data to the data warehouse. So this is our schema. Next is the username and password. You will have these for dev and prod both environments. This ensures that you have different connections when you're connecting to dev and prod. This is just the user that you create in your data warehouse. You put those credentials over here. Like if we have created user 123 in our prod or dev, then we can just come in here and put those username and password over here for the DBT to understand how to connect to that database. It is best practice that we do not put these values just like this because these are sensitive values, so we should be putting these in the environment variables, and we're going to see the practical implementation of this later on in the project, but I just wanted to show you what these things are, so I'm just displaying it like that. Next, we have got role. So which role DBT should use to connect to your data warehouse? So earlier we created DBT role for us in Snowflake. So that is what we are connecting to via dev environment. Similarly, you can have a different role or the same role for prod. This ensures that we can have auditing in place. So you can audit which user did it, what was the role for that user when they did these changes. So this all gets audited in the logs. Next is the warehouse. What is the compute that each one of these should use? We can have a separate compute for dev environment and a separate one for prod environment. So depending on what you have, you can just configure those things over here. So because we are using Snowflake, so these you could just relate it directly from how we have configured Snowflake in our first or second video when we were setting these things up. We have just taken those things and we are coming over here and updating these values. Last is threads. So like how many models DBT can build in parallel. It can be lower for dev so that we are not hogging the warehouse, so that we are not limiting the resources, and it can be higher in prod so that the schedule it finishes quickly and finishes in time, etc. So this is number of models that DBT can build in dev, which is 4, and we have made this as 8 in prod. So it just depends on how you want to do it. So this is how the profiles.yaml is laid out, and this is how we differentiate a dev environment from a prod environment. Now whatever this target value is, that will be the default value. Whenever you will do dbt run, dbt compile, or run any other command in dbt, this is what dbt will pick up for credentials. So it is always a best practice to have dev environment as the default environment, and whenever you have to push to prod, then you can just change it, override it using flags. So target defines what is the default environment that you want to use, and target is exactly the environment. So there is no word that you see here which is called as environment. We do this using target, and we have these outputs, and we refer these outputs in the target variable. Now this target is a very powerful thing in DBT. It will not only help us to just have environment aware connections like how to connect to dev or how to connect to prod, but it can also help us to write environment aware logic in our models. So how we do this is we create a Jinja object for our target. So what we can do is we can have this target, and when we do target.name, then we get those output values. So when we do target.name, we get either dev or prod depending on how we have set up. So this will either be dev or this will be prod. This is how you get. So you can put this in Jinja and have this logic embedded in your SQL somewhere or even in your YAML files. So this is how you can build your logic depending on the environment that you are in using the target variable. Similarly, if we want to get the database name, then we can just do target.database. So this is going to give us the database name, whichever is active. Then we can do target.schema. We can do target.threads. So we can do all of these things, and we can build this logic in SQL, we can build this logic in YAML, and do different things depending on whether our target is in dev or target is prod. Now, usually we just have one command that we run, which is dbt run. This is what we were doing. But to update the target, when you just run dbt run, it's going to pick up the default target. So the default value for target that we have set up is dev. As you can see from here, we have dev. If you want to override this value when you're running this command, then you can just run dbt run and then target. This is the flag that you can use, and then you can say prod. So this is how dbt will know that now it has to connect to these things and make the connection to prod rather than dev. So this is how you override it. So the moment you're going to run this dbt run target prod, target.team will have prod in it, and everywhere in your project, every model, every macro, every snapshot, etc., like whatever you are doing in dbt, you're going to run this against your prod environment. That's it for this particular video. We have covered the theoretical part related to how to set up environments in dbt. We have understood a lot of things theoretically, but we still have to do the practical implementation. Now, going back to our macros video, we used some environment specific logic for this database routing so that we can send things to dev and send things to prod using the environments that we defined in the dbt_project.yaml file. But that is not actually a best practice. I just wanted to show you a use case of how this can be done. So that's why I showed you over there. But as best practice, we should be using this target.name, especially like this target variable, for any environment specific routing or anything else. So this is what I'm going to be covering in the next video to show you the practical implementation. Please let me know if you have any questions on anything that I have discussed in this video, or if I have not included anything, then please put your suggestions in the comments below. I would definitely try to get back to you on the comments, or I'll create a separate video around those topics. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next one.